The humid Virginia air still carried the scent of magnolia blossoms when 8 of the wealthiest plantation owners in Henry County gathered at Willowbrook Estate on the evening of September 15, 1847. By dawn, all 8 men would be dead. Their bodies contorted in agony, foam dried around their lips, their final screams echoing through the grand dining hall where they had just praised the most exquisite dessert they had ever tasted. For over 150 years, local historians buried the truth about that night, dismissing it as a tragic case of food poisoning. But recently discovered documents from the Virginia State Archives reveal a far more sinister reality. A calculated act of vengeance orchestrated by a woman whose culinary skills masked one of the most methodical murder plots in American history. The woman responsible was Judith Henley, a 32-year-old slave whose extraordinary talent for creating delectable desserts concealed her extensive knowledge of Virginia's deadliest indigenous plants. Before we continue with the story of Judith Henley and the night that changed Henry County forever, make sure to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. We love hearing from fellow mystery enthusiasts across America. What drove this gifted woman to transform her greatest talent into an instrument of death would only be understood when her hidden journal was discovered in 1994. Carefully concealed within the walls of a slave cabin that had stood abandoned for nearly a century and a half, Henry County in the 1840s represented the pinnacle of Virginia's plantation aristocracy, where vast tobacco fields stretched beyond the horizon and grand estates displayed the wealth built upon human bondage. The region's fertile soil had made it one of the most prosperous areas in the South, attracting wealthy planters who competed not only in crop yields, but in the grandeur of their social gatherings and the sophistication of their tables. Among these estates, Willowbrook stood as perhaps the most magnificent. Owned by Colonel Edmund Carrington, a third-generation planter whose 3,000-acre property housed over 200 enslaved individuals. The Carrington family had built their fortune through a combination of tobacco cultivation and slave trading, with Edmund's father having established one of Virginia's most profitable slave markets in Richmond. By 1847, Colonel Carrington had expanded the family business, becoming a key figure in the interstate slave trade that separated thousands of families as the cotton boom demanded ever more laborers for the Deep South plantations. His influence extended far beyond his own property. He served on the county council, held shares in 3 local banks, and maintained correspondence with politicians in Richmond and Washington who shaped the policies that kept the plantation system thriving. Within this world of opulence built on suffering, Judith Henley occupied a unique position. Born on the plantation in 1815, she had been trained from childhood in the culinary arts by her mother Sarah, who served as head cook until her death in 1835. Judith possessed an extraordinary palate and an intuitive understanding of flavors that made her creations legendary throughout the county. Plantation wives would request her recipes, and dinner guests would praise Colonel Carrington for employing such a talented cook. Her specialties included delicate fruit tarts, elaborate wedding cakes that stood 3 feet tall, and most famously her signature honey cakes infused with wild herbs that she gathered herself from the surrounding woodlands. But Judith's talents extended far beyond the kitchen. As a child, she had formed an unlikely friendship with Ayanna, an elderly Cherokee woman who worked as a seamstress on a neighboring plantation. Despite the risks involved in such interactions, relationships between enslaved people and Native Americans were strictly monitored and often punished. Judith would slip away during her free moments to learn from Ayanna, the Cherokee woman whose own people had been forcibly relocated during the Trail of Tears in 1838, found solace in passing on her ancestral knowledge to someone who understood the pain of oppression. From Ayanna, Judith learned to identify dozens of native Virginia plants, understanding not only their nutritional and medicinal properties, but also their more dangerous applications. She discovered which mushrooms could cause vivid hallucinations, which roots could induce paralysis, and which seemingly innocent flowers contained compounds that could stop a human heart. Ayanna taught her the crucial differences between healing and harming, how the same plant that could cure a fever in small doses could cause organ failure in larger quantities. Most importantly, she learned about plants whose effects could be delayed, allowing time for the poisoner to establish an alibi while the victim remained unaware of their fate. This knowledge remained dormant for years as Judith focused on her culinary career, taking pride in her ability to create joy through food. She married Samuel, a carpenter on the plantation, in 1840, and by 1845 they had 2 children, Rebecca, age 4, and Thomas, age 2. Despite the constraints of slavery, Judith had managed to carve out a relatively stable life, earning small privileges through her exceptional skills and maintaining hope that she might one day purchase freedom for her family through the modest earnings she was occasionally allowed to keep from catering private events. The Virginia of this era existed in a constant state of tension. The abolitionist movement was gaining momentum in the North, while Southern planters responded by tightening restrictions and increasing the brutality of their control. Slave patrols roamed the countryside with greater frequency, and any sign of defiance or education among the enslaved population was met with severe punishment. The Nat Turner Rebellion of 1831 had occurred just one county away, and its memory haunted both enslaved and enslaver communities. For the planters, every gathering of slaves represented a potential conspiracy. For the enslaved, every white face could bring violence or separation from family. Within this atmosphere of fear and control, the plantation owners of Henry County formed an increasingly tight alliance. They shared information about rebellious slaves, coordinated their patrol schedules, and most crucially, collaborated in the slave trade that was becoming ever more profitable as cotton production expanded westward. Colonel Carrington had emerged as the unofficial leader of this group, hosting regular dinners where business was conducted, alongside social pleasantries. These gatherings served multiple purposes. They allowed the planters to coordinate their activities, share market information, and maintain the social bonds that kept their economic system functioning smoothly. The transformation of Judith Henley from devoted cook to methodical poisoner began on a sweltering August morning in 1846 when the sound of children's terrified screams pierced through the usual plantation noise of hammers and work songs. What Judith witnessed that day would haunt her dreams and fuel a rage so deep that it consumed every thought, every breath, every moment of her existence until she could find a way to balance the scales of justice. Rebecca and Thomas had been playing near the slave quarters when they wandered too close to the main house, chasing a butterfly that had caught their attention. The children, innocent in their joy, had not noticed Colonel Carrington emerging from his morning meeting with his overseer, James Hartwell, a man whose reputation for cruelty extended throughout the county. Hartwell, a lean, sharp-faced man with pale eyes that seemed to find pleasure in others' pain, had been drinking heavily, a habit that made his violent tendencies even more unpredictable. When Hartwell spotted the children, he flew into a rage about slaves not knowing their proper boundaries. Before Judith could intervene, having heard the commotion from the kitchen, Hartwell had seized both children. What followed was a display of brutality that served as a lesson to all who witnessed it, a reminder that even children were not safe from the absolute power wielded by white men in this world. Thomas, barely 2 years old, was held by his ankles as Hartwell struck him repeatedly with his riding crop, the leather cutting deep welts across the child's small back and legs. Rebecca, trying to protect her brother, received even worse treatment. Hartwell ordered her tied to a fence post and subjected her to 20 lashes with a bullwhip, each strike tearing through her thin dress and into her flesh. The sound of the whip cutting through air, followed by the wet slap of leather against skin, created a rhythm of horror that would replay in Judith's mind for months to come. But the physical torture was only the beginning. As Judith rushed forward, screaming for mercy, begging for the punishment to stop, Colonel Carrington himself appeared. Instead of intervening, he watched with cold satisfaction, occasionally nodding his approval at particularly vicious strikes. When Judith fell to her knees, pleading for her children's lives, Carrington's response demonstrated the calculated cruelty that lay beneath his Gentile exterior. "These children need to learn discipline," he declared, his voice carrying the casual tone he might use to discuss the weather. "But perhaps they're getting too comfortable here at Willowbrook. Perhaps they need to learn what the real world offers disobedient slaves." The threat was clear. Carrington was considering selling the children, a fate that would separate them forever from their parents and likely condemn him to even worse conditions on deep South cotton plantations. The slave trade had become increasingly brutal as demand grew, and children were often seen as future investments rather than human beings deserving of basic care. Samuel, Judith's husband, attempted to intervene, offering to take any punishment himself if the children were spared. His reward was a beating from Hartwell that left him unconscious in the dust, blood pooling beneath his head where the overseer's boot had connected with his skull repeatedly. The message was unmistakable. In this world, enslaved people had no rights, no protection, no recourse when white men decided to inflict suffering. The beating lasted nearly an hour. When it finally ended, Rebecca and Thomas lay motionless on the ground, their small bodies broken and bloodied. Rebecca's back was a mass of torn flesh, and Thomas's left arm hung at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. Both children were unconscious, their breathing shallow and labored. Dr. William Fensworth, summoned from town, examined the children with the same detached professionalism he would show to injured livestock. "The boy's arm is shattered," he reported to Carrington, speaking as if the parents weren't present. "It won't heal properly without proper care, which would be expensive. The girl has internal injuries. She may recover, but she'll likely bear the scars forever, and her capacity for heavy labor may be compromised." Carrington's response revealed the depth of his callousness. Damaged goods decrease in value. Perhaps it would be more economical to sell them now before the injuries become more apparent. The casual discussion of selling her brutally injured children as if they were defective merchandise pushed Judith beyond the breaking point. That night, as she tended to Rebecca and Thomas in their cabin, applying picuses made from herbs Ayanna had taught her to use, something fundamental changed within her. The woman who had taken pride in bringing joy through her cooking was gone, replaced by someone whose every breath was devoted to a single purpose: revenge. Over the following weeks, as her children slowly recovered, Thomas's arm healing crookedly, forever limiting his mobility, and Rebecca bearing both physical and psychological scars that would never fully fade, Judith began to plan. She observed the plantation's routines with new eyes, noting when the overseer was drunk, where Colonel Carrington conducted his business meetings, and most importantly, when and how the local planters gathered for their social and business dinners. The decision to use poison rather than direct violence was both practical and poetic. As a woman and an enslaved person, Judith had no access to weapons, no ability to confront armed white men directly. But she did have access to their food, and more crucially, she had knowledge that none of them suspected. The plants that Ayanna had taught her about grew abundantly in the Virginia woodlands, and her position as head cook provided the perfect opportunity to transform deadly knowledge into deadly meals. The irony was not lost on her. These men who took such pleasure in her culinary creations would die by the very skill they praised. The hands that had prepared countless meals to satisfy their appetites would prepare one final feast that would satisfy something far deeper. The desperate hunger for justice that gnawed at her soul every waking moment. The months following the brutal assault on her children transformed Judith Henley into a woman possessed by purpose. While she continued her daily duties in the Willowbrook kitchen, maintaining the facade of the obedient cook whose desserts were legendary throughout Henrico County, her real education was taking place in the dark, hours before dawn, and after the plantation settled into sleep. Using the pretense of gathering herbs for her cooking, Judith began systematically exploring the vast woodlands surrounding Willowbrook. Veer, Virginia's forests in the 1840s were rich with plant life that had sustained indigenous peoples for centuries, but also contained species whose properties could prove fatal to those ignorant of their true nature. Armed with the knowledge Ayanna had given her years earlier, Judith began creating a deadly botanical library. She learned to identify Aconitum napellus, known as monk's hood or wolf's bane, a beautiful purple flower whose roots contained aconitine, a compound so potent that even small amounts could cause respiratory failure. The plant grew wild in shaded areas near streams, and Judith discovered several thriving patches within a mile of the plantation. More importantly, she learned that the toxin could be extracted through careful boiling and distillation, creating a concentrated liquid that was virtually tasteless when properly prepared. From the pokeweed that grew abundantly along fence lines, she learned to extract saponins that could cause severe gastrointestinal distress and cardiac problems. The Jim's weed or devil's trumpet that flourished in disturbed soil provided tropane alkaloids that could cause delirium and respiratory paralysis. Each plant required different preparation methods, different extraction techniques, and most crucially, different dosages to achieve the desired lethal effect without arousing immediate suspicion. But Judith's most significant discovery came from an unexpected source. Ricinus communis, the castor bean plant that grew wild throughout Virginia and was even cultivated as an ornamental in some plantation gardens. From Ayanna's teachings, she knew that the beans contained ricin, one of nature's most potent toxins. What made ricin particularly suitable for her purposes was its delayed action. Victims might not show symptoms for hours or even days after ingestion, and the initial symptoms resembled common illnesses like influenza or food poisoning. The extraction of ricin required patience and precision. Judith learned to crush the beans carefully, separating the toxic proteins through a process of grinding, soaking, and filtering that had to be performed with extreme caution to avoid accidental exposure. The resulting powder was nearly odorless and could be incorporated into sweet preparations without significantly altering taste or texture. During these secret expeditions, Judith encountered others who shared her hatred of the plantation system. There was Marcus, an elderly slave on the neighboring Riverside plantation, who had lost 3 sons to the slave trade and now served as an informal network hub, passing information between plantations about overseer movements, planned sales, and opportunities for resistance. Through Marcus, Judith learned about the broader pattern of violence that characterized the relationships between the 8 most powerful planters in Henry County. These men, Colonel Edmund Carrington of Willowbrook, Major Charles Brewster of Riverside, Captain Henry Dalton of Oak Grove, William Peaton of Cedar Hill, Richard Stanfield of Magnolia Heights, George Weatherby of Pine Ridge, Dr. Franklin Pierce of Elmwood, and Judge Cornelius Hale of Fairview had formed what they called the Henrico Agricultural Association. Officially, this organization existed to share farming techniques and market information. In reality, it served as a coordination center for slave trading, punishment protocols, and the suppression of any resistance activities. The 8 men rotated, hosting duties for monthly dinners, where they conducted their most sensitive business. These gatherings were lavish affairs designed to reinforce their social bonds while they planned activities that would tear apart enslaved families and increase their profits. They shared information about rebellious slaves, coordinated the sale of problem individuals to Deep South plantations, and most disturbingly, established protocols for collective punishment when any single plantation experienced resistance. Judith learned that the brutal beating of her children had not been an isolated incident of Hartwell's drunken violence, but rather a calculated demonstration intended to send a message throughout the county's enslaved community. The 8 planters had agreed that any sign of defiance needed to be met with overwhelming brutality to prevent the kind of organized resistance that had occurred in other Virginia counties. Her children had been selected as examples, not because of any significant transgression, but because their suffering would be witnessed by the largest number of people, and thus serve as the most effective deterrent. This revelation crystallized Judith's resolve, while also providing her with the perfect opportunity. The monthly dinners brought all 8 men together in one location, making it possible to eliminate the entire network in a single evening. More importantly, these dinners always concluded with elaborate dessert presentations that showcased the culinary skills of the host plantation's kitchen staff. As Willowbrook's head cook, Judith would be personally responsible for creating the desserts when it was Colonel Carrington's turn to host. The next meeting was scheduled for September 15, 1847, just 2 months away. This gave Judith time to perfect her extraction techniques, test dosages on small animals to ensure lethality, and most crucially, develop recipes that would effectively mask the taste and texture of the various toxins she planned to incorporate. She began by experimenting with honey cakes, her signature dessert that was always requested at important gatherings. The dense sweet cake could easily conceal the slight bitterness of some plant extracts, while the honey's strong flavor would mask any residual taste from the toxic compounds. She developed a complex recipe that layered different poisons throughout the cake, rice powder mixed into the floss, aconitine extract incorporated into the honey glaze, and pokeweed saponins dissolved in the milk used for the batter. Testing was conducted with extreme caution, using small portions fed to plantation rats. Judith discovered that the combination of toxins created a synergistic effect, with each compound amplifying the lethality of the others, while maintaining the delayed onset that was crucial to her plan. The animals died within 6 to 12 hours of consuming even small amounts of the poisoned cake, showing symptoms that progressed from mild digestive discomfort to severe respiratory distress and finally cardiac arrest. As September approached, Judith's demeanor became increasingly calm, a serenity that worried Samuel, even as he couldn't understand its source. She spent hours each evening sitting with Rebecca and Thomas, holding them close while they slept, memorizing every detail of their faces and storing up reserves of love that she would need to sustain her through what was coming. She knew that her plan, if successful, would likely result in her own death. Suspected poisoners were rarely allowed to live long enough for trial, and the retribution against the enslaved community would be swift and merciless. But the thought of her children's broken bodies, the memory of their screams, and the knowledge that 8 men continued to profit from such brutality made any personal risk irrelevant. Justice, she had learned, sometimes required ultimate sacrifice. Just when Judith thought her preparations were complete, an unexpected complication arose that threatened to derail her carefully laid plans and would test her resolve in ways she had never imagined. The complication arrived on a humid Tuesday morning in early September, when Colonel Carrington announced that the upcoming dinner would be more significant than usual. A prominent slave trader from Charleston, South Carolina, named Robert Kilbourne, would be joining the gathering to discuss a massive expansion of their interstate commerce operations. Additionally, a representative from a New Orleans cotton plantation consortium would be present to negotiate bulk purchase agreements that could increase their profits exponentially. For Judith, this news presented both an opportunity and a deadly challenge. 2 additional victims would increase the impact of her revenge, but it also meant additional scrutiny of every detail of the dinner service. Kilbourne was known for his paranoia regarding food. Rumors suggested he had survived previous poisoning attempts from vengeful slaves, and he typically traveled with his own food taster, a practice that could expose Judith's plan before it began. More troubling was the timing. Colonel Carrington had moved the dinner date up by 3 days to September 12th to accommodate Kilbourne's travel schedule, giving Judith less time to prepare and forcing her to adjust her extraction timeline. She had been aging her most potent compounds to ensure maximum lethality, but now she would have to work with preparations that might be less reliable. The pressure intensified when Sarah Whitefield, Colonel Carrington's sister-in-law and a renowned hostess in her own right, arrived from Richmond to oversee the dinner preparations. Sarah had a reputation for micromanaging every aspect of entertaining, from table settings to menu selections, and her presence in the Willowbrook kitchen disrupted the routine that Judith had been counting on to conceal her activities. But it was during one of Sarah's lengthy critiques of the proposed menu that Judith overheard a conversation that nearly drove her to abandon caution entirely. Sarah was discussing the entertainment planned for after dinner, which would include a special presentation by Kilburn of his newest business venture, a breeding program designed to produce slaves with specific physical characteristics for specialized markets. Robert has developed the most innovative approach, Sarah explained to Colonel Carrington as they reviewed the evening's schedule. He's identified certain family lines that produce particularly strong field workers and others that yield more decorative specimens for household service. By controlling breeding patterns, he can guarantee delivery of specific types within predetermined time frames. The casual discussion of human beings as livestock, combined with the knowledge that her own children might someday be evaluated for such programs, filled Judith with a cold rage that threatened to overwhelm her careful planning. She wanted to strike immediately, to abandon subtlety and confront these monsters directly. But the memory of her children's broken bodies reminded her that such an approach would accomplish nothing beyond her own immediate death and likely brutal reprisals against innocent family members. Instead, she channeled her fury into perfecting her preparations. Working in the pre-dawn darkness, she increased the concentration of toxins in her compounds, accepting the risk of faster-acting poisons in exchange for absolute certainty of lethality. She also developed a backup plan, preparing additional doses of rice and powder that could be quickly added to wine or coffee if the dessert plan failed. The botanical preparations required extraordinary precision. Each plant demanded specific extraction methods to maximize potency while maintaining the appearance and taste necessary for concealment. The monk's hood roots had to be dried slowly and ground to a fine powder that could be seamlessly incorporated into flour. The pokeweed extraction involved careful boiling to concentrate the saponins while removing the bitter compounds that might alert victims to their presence. Most challenging was the rice in preparation from castor beans. The process required multiple stages of crushing, soaking, filtering, and drying to produce a powder fine enough to blend invisibly into cake batter, while concentrated enough to be lethal in the small portions that would be consumed. Judith had to perform these extractions in absolute secrecy, using equipment borrowed from the plantation's medical supplies and working only during the darkest hours when discovery was least likely. As her technical preparations advanced, Judith also began gathering intelligence about her intended victims, learning their individual preferences and dietary habits to ensure maximum consumption of the poisoned desserts. Through conversations with slaves from other plantations and careful observation during previous social gatherings, she mapped out each man's vulnerabilities. Colonel Carrington preferred honey-based desserts and always consumed multiple servings when his favorites were served. Major Brewster had a notorious sweet tooth and was known to request seconds and thirds of particularly appealing cakes. Captain Dalton was diabetic and usually avoided sweets entirely, but made exceptions for special occasions when peer pressure demanded participation. This information allowed Judith to design her recipe with varying concentrations of different toxins, ensuring that even minimal consumption would prove fatal. The psychological pressure of maintaining her normal routine while preparing for mass murder began to take its toll on Judith's mental state. She found herself studying the faces of white people on the plantation with new intensity, wondering which of them would survive the coming violence and which would suffer in the inevitable retaliation. Samuel noticed her increased agitation and attempted several times to discover what was troubling his wife, but Judith knew that sharing her plans would only endanger him and potentially compromise her mission. Sleep became elusive as the date approached. When Judith did manage to rest, her dreams were filled with images of her children's torture, mixed with fantasies of watching the plantation owners writhe in agony as the poisons took effect. She would wake in cold sweats, her heart racing, unsure whether the emotions flooding through her were anticipation or terror. 3 days before the dinner, Marcus brought disturbing news from the informal slave communication network that operated throughout Henrio County. Rumors were circulating about unusual activity among the plantation owners, increased patrols, restrictions on slave movement, and private meetings that excluded their usual social associates. Some suspected that a major crackdown on resistance activities was being planned, possibly including mass sales to Deep South cotton plantations where conditions were notoriously harsh. This intelligence suggested that Judith's window for action was rapidly closing. If she didn't strike on September 12th, the opportunity might never come again, and the 8 men who had brutalized her children would continue their systematic destruction of enslaved families throughout the region. The weight of representing not just her own desire for revenge, but the hopes of hundreds of other victims added another layer of pressure to her already overwhelming burden. On the morning of September the 10th, just 2 days before the fateful dinner, Judith received her final preparations and made peace with the knowledge that she was probably preparing for her own death, as well as that of her enemies. She spent extra time with Rebecca and Thomas that evening, reading them stories and singing the lullabies her own mother had taught her, storing up memories that would have to sustain her through whatever came next. But as dawn broke on September 11th, an unexpected visitor arrived at Willowbrook, who would force Judith to confront the possibility that her carefully laid plans might not unfold as she had envisioned, and that the line between justice and murder might be more complex than her wounded heart had allowed her to consider. The unexpected visitor was Dr. Ezra Langford, a physician from Richmond whose reputation for treating both enslaved and free populations had earned him an unusual position in Virginia society. Unlike most white medical practitioners who viewed slaves as property requiring minimal care, Dr. Langford had studied at Edinburgh and brought European ideas about public health that emphasized the interconnectedness of community welfare regardless of social status. Dr. Langford's arrival at Willowbrook was ostensibly to examine several slaves who had been showing symptoms of what Colonel Carrington described as a summer fever. But his true purpose became clear when he requested a private conversation with Judith about her medicinal herb knowledge. Word of her skills in preparing healing remedies had reached Richmond through the informal networks that connected Virginia's medical practitioners. "I understand you have considerable knowledge of local plants," Dr. Langford said carefully as they walked through the kitchen garden behind the main house. "I'm hoping you might assist me in identifying some specimens I've collected for medicinal research." As he opened his leather satchel, Judith's heart nearly stopped. Among the carefully pressed specimens were samples of monkshood, pokeweed, and most alarmingly, castor bean plants, the exact species she had been using for her poison preparations. The doctor's keen gray eyes studied her face intently as he displayed each plant, clearly watching for reactions that might indicate familiarity. "These particular species have been found near several plantations where unusual deaths have occurred recently," Dr. Langford continued, his voice maintaining professional neutrality, while his words carried unmistakable implications. "I'm investigating whether natural toxins might be responsible for symptoms that have been attributed to various illnesses." The conversation was a carefully orchestrated test, and Judith realized that her activities had not gone as unnoticed as she had believed. Someone, perhaps multiple people, had observed her botanical expedit ions or noticed correlations between plant locations and her movement patterns. Dr. Langford's presence suggested that authorities might already be suspicious of poisoning activities, even if they hadn't yet identified her as the perpetrator. Fighting to maintain composure, Judith acknowledged familiarity with the plants for their medicinal properties while carefully avoiding any mention of their toxic potential. She described traditional uses for treating minor ailments, explaining how her knowledge had been passed down through generations of slave healers who had learned to supplement inadequate medical care with folk remedies. Dr. Langford listened intently, occasionally taking notes in a small leather-bound journal. When she finished, he closed the satchel and regarded her with an expression that seemed to combine professional curiosity with genuine concern. "Miss Judith," he said quietly, ensuring their conversation couldn't be overheard. "I want you to understand that my investigation is focused on preventing unnecessary deaths regardless of who might be at risk. Sometimes when people have been pushed beyond endurance, they consider actions that might seem justified in the moment but could lead to consequences far worse than the original injuries." The warning was unmistakable, and Judith realized that Dr. Langford suspected her intentions without having sufficient evidence to prevent them. His position was delicate. As a physician who treated enslaved populations, he had undoubtedly witnessed countless atrocities that would drive any reasonable person to thoughts of revenge. But his professional obligations required him to prevent harm, regardless of his personal sympathies. That evening, as Judith reviewed her preparations for the dinner, now just 24 hours away, she found herself grappling with doubts that hadn't troubled her during months of planning. Dr. Langford's intervention had forced her to confront the broader implications of her actions. The deaths of 8 prominent planters would certainly trigger massive retaliation against the enslaved Pitao population throughout Henrio County. Innocent people would suffer torture, sale, and death as authorities sought to identify and punish anyone connected to the poisoning. But these moral considerations warred against the memory of her children's screams and the knowledge that inaction would allow the systematic brutalization to continue indefinitely. The 8 men gathering at Willowbrook tomorrow night represented the core of a system that treated human beings as disposable property, and their deaths might save hundreds of future victims from similar fates. The internal conflict was resolved by an incident that occurred late that evening when Overseer James Hartwell, drunk and violent as usual, decided to make another example of plantation discipline. His target was elderly Moses, a field worker whose arthritic hands had slowed his cotton picking in recent weeks. Hartwell's lesson involved tying Moses to a tree and whipping him with such ferocity that the old man's screams could be heard throughout the slave quarters. As Judith watched from her cabin window, she saw her neighbors cowering in their homes, afraid to intervene or even acknowledge the violence occurring just yards away. The systematic terror that kept an entire community in constant fear crystallized her resolve and eliminated any remaining doubts about her mission. These people needed someone willing to take ultimate risks for their protection, and circumstance had placed her in the unique position to act. The night of September 11th was spent in final preparations that required absolute precision and nerves of steel. Working by candlelight in the darkest corner of the kitchen, Judith combined her various toxic compounds into the honey cake batter that would serve as the delivery system for her revenge. The recipe had been perfected through weeks of testing, with each ingredient carefully measured to ensure lethal dosages while maintaining the appearance and taste that would encourage consumption. The base cake contained ricin powder mixed directly into the flour, ensuring that every bite would contain a fatal dose. The honey glaze incorporated concentrated aconitine, extract that would be absorbed through the mouth and stomach lining, causing respiratory failure within hours. Finally, the decorative frosting contained dissolved pokeed saponins that would attack the cardiovascular system while mimicking symptoms of heart disease, a common cause of death among wealthy men of this era. As dawn approached on September 12th, Judith completed her preparations and began the normal day's routine of food preparation for the evening's dinner. To outside observers, she appeared calm and focused. The consummate professional cook preparing for an important social gathering. Only the slight tremor in her hands when she thought no one was looking betrayed the enormous pressure she was carrying. The other enslaved workers in the kitchen noticed her unusual attention to detail as she prepared the honey cakes, but attributed it to the importance of the evening's guests rather than any sinister purpose. Judith had spent months establishing normal patterns of behavior that would deflect suspicion, and her reputation for perfectionism provided cover for the extraordinary care she was taking with this particular dessert. By afternoon, the main house was bustling with preparation activities as Colonel Carrington's staff arranged furniture, polished silver, and prepared guest rooms for visitors who would be staying overnight. The 8 plantation owners began arriving in the late afternoon, their carriages creating clouds of dust as they rolled up the circular drive to Willowbrook's imposing main entrance. From the kitchen windows, Judith watched each man arrive, mentally reviewing what she knew about their individual roles in perpetuating the system that had broken her children's bodies and countless other families throughout the region. Tonight, she would serve them the most exquisite dessert they had ever tasted, and it would be the last food they ever consumed. As evening shadows lengthened across Willowbrook's manicured grounds, Judith made final adjustments to her honey cakes and prepared to serve justice on a silver platter, knowing that by dawn either her mission would be complete or she would be dead, but that either outcome was preferable to allowing these men to continue their reign of terror unchallenged. The evening of September 12, 1847, began with all the grandeur that Colonel Carrington's social gatherings were known for throughout Henry County. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over mahogany tables laden with the finest china, while the sound of cultured conversation and clinking glasses filled the air. The 8 plantation owners, dressed in their finest evening wear, moved through Willowbrook's elegant parlor with the confident bearing of men who had never questioned their absolute authority over the lives of others. Judith observed the gathering from her position, supervising the kitchen staff, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and terror as she watched the men whose brutality had shattered her world, now laughing and socializing as if they were pillars of civilized society. Colonel Carrington played the perfect host, regaling his guests with stories of recent successful slave sales, while Major Brewster described new punishment techniques he had implemented at Riverside Plantation. The conversation during the appetizer course centered on business matters, crop yields, market prices, and most disturbingly plans for expanding their slave trading operations into new territories. Captain Dalton had recently returned from Mississippi, where he had observed cotton plantation operations that impressed him with their efficiency in managing large enslaved populations. His descriptions of the brutal working conditions and systematic family separations were met with enthusiastic interest rather than horror. The key, Dalton explained, between sips of imported wine is maintaining complete psychological control. These Mississippi planters have perfected techniques that break resistance before it can develop. Children are separated from parents by age 5, preventing the formation of family bonds that might encourage rebellion. Judge Hale nodded approvingly. We've been too sentimental in our approach here in Virginia. Allowing families to remain together creates emotional attachments that interfere with discipline and productivity. As Judith listened to this casual discussion of deliberately destroying family bonds, her resolve crystallized into something harder than steel. These men spoke of human beings as if they were livestock to be bred and managed for maximum profit, showing no recognition of the suffering their policies inflicted. The brutal beating of her children had not been an aberration, but rather a calculated demonstration of the systematic cruelty that defined their entire worldview. The main course proceeded with discussions of political developments in Richmond and Washington that might affect their business interests. The recent territorial acquisitions following the Mexican-American War had created new opportunities for plantation expansion, and the 8 men debated strategies for claiming the most profitable lands while ensuring that slavery remained legal in the new territories. Robert Kilbourne, the Charleston slave trader, dominated much of the conversation with his expertise in interstate commerce. His reputation for ruthless efficiency had made him wealthy beyond most men's dreams, and his stories of successful sales campaigns revealed a mind that had reduced human trafficking to a precise science. He described his methods for evaluating merchandise, techniques for suppressing resistance during transport, and marketing strategies that maximize profits by appealing to buyers' specific needs. The key to success in this business, Kilbourne explained while cutting his beef, is understanding that sentiment is the enemy of profit. The moment you begin viewing these people as anything more than valuable property, you compromise your ability to make necessary business decisions. William Piton raised his glass in appreciation. That's precisely the attitude that separates successful planters from those who struggle with discipline problems. We must never forget that maintaining control requires constant demonstration of absolute authority. The conversation continued through multiple courses, each topic reinforcing Judith's understanding that these men represented the very worst aspects of human nature. They discussed new laws designed to restrict slave movement, shared techniques for preventing literacy, and exchanged information about resistance activities that needed to be suppressed. Every word they spoke demonstrated their complete dehumanization of the people whose labor had built their wealth. As the evening progressed toward dessert service, Judith made final preparations in the kitchen, her hands remarkably steady despite the enormous pressure she was carrying. The honey cakes had been prepared to perfection, their golden surfaces gleaming with the toxic glaze that would deliver her carefully crafted revenge. The sweet aroma that filled the kitchen masked the odorless compounds that would end 8 lives before dawn. She had prepared individual cakes for each guest, ensuring that portion sizes would deliver lethal doses regardless of each man's eating habits. The desserts were arranged on Willowbrook's finest silver platters, surrounded by decorative garnishes that made them appear even more irresistible. To any observer, they represented the pinnacle of culinary artistry, beautiful, elegant, and utterly delicious. When Colonel Carrington called for dessert service, Judith personally carried the first platter into the dining room, her heart hammering in her chest as she approached the table where her children's torturers sat in comfortable conversation. The men looked up expectantly as she presented the cakes, their faces showing the appreciation that her culinary skills had always inspired. "Gentlemen," Colonel Carrington announced with obvious pride, "you are about to experience Judith's renowned honey cakes, prepared specially for this evening with her secret blend of Virginia wildflower honey and herbs gathered from our own woodlands." The irony of his words, praising the very ingredients that would kill him, nearly caused Judith to smile as she distributed the individual desserts with ceremonial precision. Each man received his portion with compliments about the appearance and aroma, several commenting on their anticipation of tasting her legendary creation. Dr. Franklin Pierce, the physician among the group, examined his cake with particular interest. "The presentation is exquisite, Judith. The glaze has an unusual depth of color. What gives it that distinctive appearance?" "Wild honey, sir," Judith replied, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "Collected from bees that feed on native Virginia flowers. It creates flavors that can't be duplicated with commercial honey." The explanation satisfied Pierce's curiosity, and he lifted his fork with the same anticipation shown by his companions. Around the table, 8 forks descended toward 8 perfectly crafted instruments of death, each bite calculated to deliver justice for crimes that no court would ever prosecute. Major Brewster was the first to taste his cake, closing his eyes in appreciation as the complex flavors filled his mouth. "Extraordinary," he murmured. "This may be the finest dessert I've ever experienced." One by one, the other men began eating, their faces showing genuine pleasure as they consumed the toxic confections. Judge Hale consumed his entire portion within minutes, requesting seconds that Judith gladly provided from the additional cakes she had prepared. Captain Dalton, despite his usual dietary restrictions, abandoned caution and indulged in multiple bites, praising the dessert's exceptional quality. Robert Kilbourne proved the most appreciative consumer, finishing his cake quickly and engaging Judith in detailed conversation about her techniques and ingredients. His questions were thorough and technical, demonstrating genuine interest in culinary arts that seemed incongruous with his brutal profession. But even as he praised her skills, his casual mentions of recent slave purchases reminded Judith of the suffering he had inflicted on countless families. The consumption phase lasted nearly 35 minutes, during which every guest consumed multiple servings of the poisoned desserts. Judith maintained her professional demeanor throughout, accepting compliments graciously while internally calculating the dosages each man had ingested. By her estimates, even the lightest consumers had taken in enough toxins to ensure death within hours. As the dinner party moved to the parlor for brandy and cigars, Judith retreated to the kitchen to begin cleaning while privately monitoring the time. The various poisons she had used worked at different rates, but all would become active within the next few hours. The Ryan would begin affecting cellular function immediately, though symptoms might not appear for some time. The aconitine would target the nervous system more rapidly, potentially causing the first visible signs of distress within an hour or two. The first indication that her plan was succeeding came approximately 90 minutes after dessert service when she heard unusual commotion from the parlor. Peering through the service door, she observed Judge Hale doubled over in his chair, his face pale and sweating as he complained of sudden nausea and dizziness. Dr. Pierce, ironically positioned to provide medical assistance, I booted the symptoms to overindulgence and recommended rest. Within minutes, however, other guests began showing similar symptoms. Major Brewster excused himself to vomit violently in the garden while Captain Dalton complained of severe abdominal cramping that made standing difficult. The social atmosphere deteriorated rapidly as more men succumbed to increasingly severe distress. Dr. Pierce's medical training allowed him to recognize that the symptoms were too uniform and severe to represent simple food poisoning. "Something is seriously wrong here," he announced, his own voice beginning to slur as the toxins affected his nervous system. "These symptoms suggest systematic poisoning." The accusation sent shockwaves through the remaining conscious guests, but by then it was too late for effective countermeasures. The combination of toxins Judith had employed created a synergistic effect that overwhelmed the body's natural defenses while producing symptoms that progressed too rapidly for medical intervention. Even if antidotes had been available, the dosages consumed were far beyond survivable levels. Colonel Carrington, despite his own increasing distress, managed to summon plantation security and demand that all enslaved workers be detained for questioning. But his orders came out as incoherent mumbling as the aconitine attacked his nervous system, causing the muscle paralysis that would eventually stop his breathing. The scene in Willowbrook's elegant parlor transformed from a Gentile social gathering to a nightmare of human suffering as 8 of Virginia's most powerful men died in agony, their bodies racked by the very toxins that grew wild in the forests surrounding their plantations. The poetic justice was not lost on Judith as she watched from the kitchen, seeing her children's torturers experience the helplessness and pain they had inflicted on so many others. Robert Kilbourne, whose paranoia about poisoning had made him legendary, lasted longest due to his habit of consuming smaller portions and his body's previous exposure to various toxins. But even his survival instincts couldn't overcome the lethal concentrations Judith had prepared. His final words, gasped out as respiratory failure set in, were a whispered confession of the hundreds of families he had destroyed through his slave trading operations. By dawn on September 13th, 8 bodies lay still in Willowbrook's parlor, their faces frozen in expressions of shock and agony that bore witness to the justice finally served for their countless crimes. Judith had achieved her revenge, but she knew that the most dangerous part of her plan was yet to come: surviving the investigation that would inevitably follow. The discovery of 8 dead plantation owners in Willowbrook's parlor sent shockwaves throughout Virginia that reverberated all the way to Richmond and Washington. By noon on September 13th, the Henry County Sheriff, the state militia, and federal investigators had descended upon the plantation, transforming the elegant estate into a crime scene bristling with armed men determined to find those responsible for what newspapers would later call the most audacious act of slave rebellion in Virginia history. The initial investigation proceeded exactly as Judith had anticipated. Suspicion immediately fell upon the enslaved population, with authorities operating under the assumption that such a coordinated poisoning could only have been accomplished through a widespread conspiracy. Colonel Carrington's overseer, James Hartwell, who had been absent during the dinner due to his own drunken stupor, emerged as the primary investigator, his rage over his employer's death making him even more vicious than usual. Hartwell's interrogation methods involved systematic torture designed to extract confessions from anyone who might have had access to the kitchen or knowledge of the evening's menu. Judith watched in horror as innocent people were subjected to beatings, near drownings, and other forms of brutality that authorities justified as necessary measures to solve such a heinous crime. The irony that the investigation was being conducted by the same type of men who had just been eliminated was not lost on her, but it provided little comfort as she witnessed the suffering of her community. Dr. Ezra Langford's arrival on the second day of the investigation introduced a more scientific approach to determining the cause of death. His examination of the bodies revealed symptoms consistent with multiple plant-based toxins, confirming his earlier suspicions about poisoning activities in the region. However, his attempts to conduct a methodical investigation were hampered by Hartwell's violent interrogation methods and the political pressure to quickly identify and punish the perpetrators. The breakthrough in the investigation came from an unexpected source: Sarah Whitefield, Colonel Carrington's sister-in-law, who had observed Judith's unusually meticulous preparation of the honey cakes. Her testimony about the cook's behavior on the day of the dinner, combined with Dr. Langford's botanical analysis of toxic plants found in the surrounding woodlands, focused suspicion directly on Judith. When authorities searched her cabin on September 16th, they discovered carefully hidden evidence that confirmed their suspicions. Concealed within the walls were dried plant materials, extraction equipment, and most damning of all, a detailed journal documenting her poison preparation methods and her plans for revenge. The journal, written in a mixture of English and symbols that Ayanna had taught her, provided a complete confession of her activities and motivations. The journal's contents revealed not just the technical aspects of her poisoning plan, but also the emotional journey that had driven her to such desperate action. Page after page documented the brutal treatment of her children, the systematic dehumanization practiced by the plantation owners, and her growing conviction that only their deaths could prevent continued atrocities against the enslaved community. One passage written just days before the fatal dinner captured the depth of her resolve. They speak of us as animals, treat us as property, and destroy our families for their profit. Tonight I serve them the justice that no court will ever provide. If this kills me, let it be known that I died trying to protect those who cannot protect themselves. The discovery of the journal eliminated any doubt about Judith's guilt, but it also created unexpected complications for authorities seeking to manage the political implications of the case. The detailed documentation of abuse suffered by enslaved families made it difficult to present the poisoning as an unprovoked act of violence. Some investigators found themselves uncomfortably confronted with evidence of systematic brutality that challenged their assumptions about the moral legitimacy of the plantation system. Dr. Langford's medical report, submitted to state authorities on September 20th, provided technical confirmation of Judith's methods while including observations that subtly criticized the conditions that had driven her to such extreme action. His description of the children's injuries, documented through his examination of Rebecca and Thomas, created an official record of the violence that had triggered the entire sequence of events. The trial, conducted in Richmond due to the high-profile nature of the case, became a sensation that drew observers from throughout the South. Judith's defense attorney, appointed by the court but sympathetic to abolitionist causes, attempted to argue that the systematic abuse documented in her journal constituted extenuating circumstances that should influence sentencing. However, Virginia law provided no recognition of slave testimony against white persons, making it impossible to present much of the evidence that might have explained her motivations. The prosecution, led by the state's most experienced criminal attorney, focused on the premeditated nature of the poisoning and the threat it represented to social order throughout the South. They argued that allowing any mitigation of punishment would encourage similar acts of resistance and potentially trigger widespread slave rebellion. The case became a proxy for broader debates about slavery, resistance, and the maintenance of white supremacist social structures. Judith's testimony, delivered with calm dignity that impressed even hostile observers, provided the most compelling moments of the trial. Speaking directly to the jury, she explained her actions without expressing regret, describing the systematic brutality that had driven her to seek justice through poison when no legal remedies existed for enslaved people. "I am not sorry that these men are dead," she stated clearly. "I am sorry that their deaths will bring suffering to innocent people in my community, but I could not continue living knowing that they would torture and kill more children while I did nothing to stop them." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all charges. The sentence, death by hanging, surprised no one, but the judge's comments during sentencing revealed the complex emotions the case had aroused. While condemning Judith's actions as unforgivable crimes against social order, he also acknowledged the unfortunate circumstances that had contributed to her desperation. Judith was executed on November 15, 1847, before a crowd of nearly 2,000 people who had gathered to witness what newspapers called the final chapter in Virginia's most shocking crime. Her final words, spoken from the gallows with remarkable composure, became legendary throughout the enslaved community. "My children will grow up knowing that their mother chose death over submission to evil." The aftermath of the case extended far beyond Judith's execution. The deaths of 8 prominent plantation owners created a power vacuum that took years to fill, during which time many enslaved families experienced slightly less brutal treatment as new overseers and owners established their authority. More significantly, the detailed documentation of plantation brutality that emerged during the trial provided ammunition for abolitionist activists who used Judith's story to argue against the moral legitimacy of slavery. The plantation owners' deaths also disrupted their slave trading network, temporarily reducing the interstate commerce that separated thousands of families annually. While new traders eventually filled the void, the interruption provided respite for many who might otherwise have been sold to Deep South cotton plantations during this period. Judith's journal, confiscated as evidence during the trial, was presumed destroyed along with other case materials. However, in 1994, renovation work at the old Henry County Courthouse uncovered a cache of historical documents that had been sealed behind a false wall. Among these papers was Judith's complete journal, providing historians with unprecedented insight into the thoughts and methods of one of America's most methodical poisoners. The journal's rediscovery sparked new interest in the case and led to re-examination of other mysterious deaths in antebellum Virginia. Researchers identified several similar cases where enslaved cooks had been suspected of poisoning their owners, suggesting that Judith's actions may have been part of a broader pattern of resistance that has been largely hidden from historical records. Rebecca and Thomas Henley survived their childhood trauma and were eventually sold to different plantations, but both lived to see emancipation in 1865. Rebecca's descendants, interviewed by historians in the 1930s, preserved oral traditions about their ancestor that confirmed many details found in the journal. They spoke of Judith not as a criminal, but as a hero who had sacrificed her life to protect others from unspeakable cruelty. The Willowbrook plantation itself was abandoned within a decade of the poisoning, as subsequent owners found it impossible to maintain profitable operations amid persistent rumors that the property was cursed. The main house gradually fell into ruin, and by the end of the 19th century only foundations remained visible among the encroaching forest growth. Today the site where 8 plantation owners died from expertly prepared poison is marked only by historical surveys that note the location of a significant 19th century estate. The true story of what happened there remains buried in archives and family memories. A reminder that some forms of justice operate outside the boundaries of law and social convention. This mystery shows us that the most ordinary skills, in this case a talent for cooking, can become instruments of extraordinary justice when wielded by someone pushed beyond all reasonable limits. Judith Henley's story challenges us to consider the complex moral calculations that people make when legal systems fail to protect the innocent and when systematic oppression leaves no alternatives to desperate action. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Judith's actions were justified by the circumstances she faced? Leave your comment below sharing your thoughts about this extraordinary act of resistance. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories about America's hidden history, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates the complexity of historical justice. See you in the next video where we'll explore another dark chapter from America's past that raises questions about the price of survival in an unjust world.